Jake Mitchell had a simple life. He didn't ask for much, just his land, his animals, and the peace that came with both. Every morning, he'd wake up with the first golden rays of sunlight stretching over the vast fields of Mitchell Farms, breathing in the crisp air filled with the scent of fresh earth and hay. His farm, passed down through generations, was more than just a livelihood, it was his legacy. Jake loved the way the rooster's crow signaled the start of the day, the rhythmic sounds of cattle lowing in the distance, and the satisfying creak of his old wooden porch as he sat with his steaming cup of coffee. It was a life built on hard work, sweat, and the simple joys of nature. But peace, as Jake would soon find out, was a fragile thing. That peace was about to be shattered by a force far more persistent than any drought, storm, or wild predator. This was a threat unlike anything his ancestors had faced. Her name was Karen Whitmore. Karen wasn't just any Karen. She was the self-appointed queen of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association. 5 years ago, Crestwood had been nothing but empty lots and construction crews. Now, it was an immaculate suburban community filled with rows of cookie-cutter houses, manicured lawns, and people who lived by HOA rulebooks as if they were sacred texts. And at the heart of it all was Karen. She thrived on order, control, and the intoxicating power of enforcing rules no one actually remembered voting for. The color of your mailbox, regulated. The height of your grass, measured weekly. Even the number of decorative garden gnomes, strictly limited to 2 per household. Jake had never cared about Crestwood Estates until he found out that Crestwood Estates cared about him. See, Jake's farm wasn't technically inside the HOA's boundaries. It sat just beyond their pristine neighborhood, an expanse of land untouched by Crestwood's regulations. But that didn't stop Karen from seeing it as her personal problem. And to her, it was a big problem. His red barn, his animals, his gravel driveway, all of it was an eyesore to her vision of a perfect community. It didn't matter that his farm had been there long before Crestwood. As far as she was concerned, it didn't belong, and Karen always got what she wanted. Jake was mid-sip of his morning coffee when he spotted the approaching storm, though this one wasn't made of dark clouds or thunder. No, this one wore an impeccably pressed beige pantsuit, clutched a clipboard like a weapon, and had the determined stride of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. She marched up his driveway as if she owned the place, her high heels clicking against the gravel. Jake exhaled slowly, setting down his coffee cup. This ought to be good. "Good morning," she called, her voice clipped, professional, like a telemarketer who had already decided you needed whatever they were selling. Jake leaned back in his chair, eyes twinkling with mild amusement. "Here we go." "You must be Mr. Mitchell," she continued, stopping just at the base of his porch steps. "That's me," Jake replied, taking another slow sip. Karen flashed a tight-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to have a little chat about your property." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know my property had anything to do with Crestwood Estates." Karen's smile stiffened. "Well, technically it doesn't. But it is adjacent to our community, and, as I'm sure you understand, property values are a very delicate matter." Jake barely held back a chuckle. "Ah, so that was it. We've received multiple complaints," Karen went on, flipping through her clipboard as if reading from a script. "The noise, the smell, the visual impact on the neighborhood." Jake tilted his head. "Visual impact?" Karen nodded, all seriousness. "We have a certain aesthetic we like to maintain, Mr. Mitchell, and frankly, your farm would benefit from some adjustments." Jake took a slow breath, suppressing the urge to laugh. "Adjustments? For starters, that big red barn is quite an eyesore. Perhaps you could repaint it a more neutral color, or better yet, downsize it altogether." Jake blinked. Was she serious? "And then there's the matter of your rooster," she continued. "Some of our residents have mentioned being woken up before sunrise. It's quite disruptive." Jake ran a hand over his chin as if deep in thought. Finally he said, "So, let me get this straight. You want me to change the color of my barn and somehow convince a rooster to hit the snooze button? Because your residents don't like the sound of the countryside?" Karen's smile remained fixed, but her eyes flashed with impatience. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand that change can be difficult, but this is really in everyone's best interest. I'd hate for this to become complicated." Jake sighed, standing up and stretching. "Well, Miss Whitmore, I appreciate you stopping by, but my farm isn't part of the HOA. I don't answer to your rules. And as far as I can tell, my land, my barn, and my animals aren't hurting anyone. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that," she said sharply, turning on her heel and marching back to her car. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He had dealt with stubborn animals before, but something told him Karen was going to be a whole different kind of problem. And boy, was he right. Jake thought that would be the end of it. He figured Karen would stomp back to her pristine neighborhood, fume about the injustice of it all, and eventually find something else to obsess over. After all, she couldn't force him to change anything. His farm had been standing long before Crestwood Estates ever existed, and more importantly, it wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. But Karen wasn't the type to take no for an answer. The first signs of trouble came subtly. At first it was just letters, official-looking notices stamped with the HOA's insignia, demanding that he comply with neighborhood standards and consider the impact of his property on the surrounding community. Jake chuckled as he tossed them straight into the trash. Then the complaints started rolling in. Calls to the county zoning office, the health department, and even animal control. One by one, officials showed up at his doorstep, clipboards in hand, expecting to find some sort of violations, but every single time they left empty-handed. His farm was perfectly within code, his animals were well cared for, and the land was properly maintained. After the third visit in a single week, the health department inspector, a grizzled man named Roger, gave Jake a knowing look. "Son," he said, shaking his head, "I don't know who you pissed off, but they're sure determined to make your life hell." Jake smirked. "Let me guess. Name starts with a K?" Roger sighed. "Can't say officially, but off the record, yeah, it's Karen." Jake had expected her to be persistent, but this was next-level petty. It was war. Karen wasn't getting the results she wanted, so she upped the ante. A week later, she showed up again, but this time she wasn't alone. Flanking her were two equally self-important HOA board members, one a wiry man with thick-rimmed glasses, the other a stern-looking woman clutching a folder of documents like it held the secrets to the universe. Jake, who had been fixing a section of his fence, wiped his hands on a rag and sighed. "You again?" Karen let out an exaggerated sigh, as if his very existence exhausted her. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, feigning patience, "I was hoping we could handle this civilly, but you continue to ignore our requests." Jake crossed his arms. "That's because your requests are ridiculous." Karen ignored him, shoving a document into his hands. "As per HOA regulations—" "I'm not in your HOA," Jake interrupted, waving the paper back at her. Karen's jaw tightened. "As per HOA regulations, all properties within visual range of Crestwood Estates must adhere to community aesthetic guidelines. We are prepared to take further action if necessary." Jake let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Lady, you're not my landlord. You don't have any authority here." But then the man with the glasses spoke up. "We have been in contact with county officials regarding zoning laws. If your farm is found to be in violation of certain regulations, you may be subject to fines." Jake's amusement faded slightly. He knew his farm was in perfect compliance with agricultural zoning, but he also knew people like Karen. They would dig and dig, looking for any excuse to make his life miserable. "Well," Jake said, stepping closer, his voice steady, "you do what you have to do. But if you or anyone from your HOA steps foot on my land again, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing." For the first time, Karen's expression cracked. A flicker of frustration crossed her face before she masked it again. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," she snapped. "No," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "I think you are." With that, he turned his back on her and walked away, leaving Karen and her lackeys fuming. Jake hoped that would be the final straw. He figured Karen would realize she couldn't bully him into submission. But he underestimated just how far she was willing to go. One afternoon, while Jake was repairing another section of his fence, he heard a chainsaw. Not just any chainsaw, one that was far too close to his property line. His stomach dropped. Setting down his tools, he stormed toward the sound. What he saw made his blood boil. A group of hired workers were in the process of putting up a high steel gray fence right on his land, and who was supervising? Karen, clipboard in hand, smug as ever. Jake strode up, voice like steel. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen turned, her expression the perfect blend of fake surprise and feigned politeness. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell," she said, as if they were old friends, "just implementing some community improvements. This new privacy fence will help protect the visual harmony of Crestwood Estates." Jake gestured at the workers, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "This fence is on my land." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Well, that's debatable. You see, we reviewed older survey maps and believe the original property lines were drawn incorrectly. Since your farm borders our neighborhood, it's in everyone's best interest to adjust accordingly." Jake's fingers curled into fists. They were literally trying to steal his land. "You believe the property lines were incorrect?" he repeated, voice dangerously calm. "Yes," Karen said smoothly. "And until we receive further clarification, we're proceeding with this improvement project." Jake took a slow, deliberate step forward, locking eyes with the workers. "You boys got a permit for this?" One of them hesitated before muttering, HOA told us they had all the legal permissions." Jake smirked. "They don't. And if you don't pack up and leave in the next 5 minutes, you're trespassing. Which means I'll be calling the sheriff and you will be the ones in legal trouble." That did it. The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them shut off the chainsaw. They started gathering their equipment, clearly not willing to go to jail for an overzealous HO. Karen, however, was livid. "You can't just order them to leave," she snapped. "This is a community decision." Jake pulled out his phone and, in full view of everyone, started dialing the sheriff's number. "Then let's make it official," he said. "Let's have the county sorted out." Karen paled. "There's no need for that," she said, stiffly. "Then you'd best tell your people to pack it up," Jake said, voice dripping with amusement. With a murderous glare, Karen signaled for the workers to leave. But Jake knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to take defeat lightly. And something told him she was about to get even more desperate. Karen wasn't just defeated, she was humiliated. The fence incident should have been her wake-up call, the moment she realized she had picked the wrong fight. But Karen didn't know how to quit. Instead of backing down, she doubled down, pushing her war against Jake to a dangerous new level. A few days after the fence fiasco, Jake woke up to find something infuriating right at the edge of his property. A massive for sale sign, positioned near the road as if his farm had suddenly hit the market. Beneath it, in bold letters, read, "Under negotiation, coming soon to Crestwood Estates." Jake froze, staring at the sign in disbelief. She wouldn't. No way. This was insane, even for Karen. But the sign was there, mocking him. His blood ran hot, his jaw clenched, and without a second thought he marched over, ripped it straight out of the ground, and stormed back toward his house, ready to call every lawyer in the county. But before he could even dial a number, a familiar, smug voice called out from behind him. "Oh, good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Karen chirped, striding up his driveway as if she belonged there. "I see you've noticed the sign. There's been a misunderstanding, I'm sure." Jake spun around, his grip tightening on the wooden stake in his hand. "You want to explain to me why there's a for sale sign on my land?" His voice was low, dangerous. Karen didn't flinch. She tilted her head, eyes gleaming as if she had been waiting for this confrontation. "Well," she said sweetly, "the HOA has been in discussions about acquiring nearby properties for future expansion. Some realtors assumed your farm was included in the new Crestwood development. The sign was placed prematurely, that's all." Jake stared at her, deadpan. "So you're telling me a real estate agency just mistakenly put a sign on my property, completely by accident?" Karen's smile faltered just for a second. "Perhaps there was some enthusiasm about the prospect," she admitted, her voice dripping with fake innocence. "But think about it, Mr. Mitchell. This could be a great opportunity for you. The community is growing, and your land could be worth far more if you were willing to sell." Jake let out a low, humorless laugh. "Let me make this crystal clear, Karen. I'm not selling. I will never sell. And if I see another sign like this on my land, I won't just be tearing it down. I'll be suing your entire HOA for fraud." Karen's expression tightened. "Now, Mr. Mitchell, let's not be hasty. No need to bring lawyers into this." Jake pulled out his phone. "Oh, I'll bring in the county too if you'd like. I'm sure they'd love to hear how the HOA is trying to illegally claim private property." For the first time, Karen looked nervous. She opened her mouth, then shut it, clearly calculating her next move. But she knew she had pushed too far this time. With an angry huff, she spun on her heel and stormed off, muttering something under her breath. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. She wasn't done, he knew it, but neither was he. What happened next proved just how far Karen was willing to go. The following morning, Jake noticed something strange, a black SUV parked near his fence line. At first he thought it was just some nosy HOA member, but then he saw it, a drone. It hovered over his land, moving deliberately, as if scanning his property. Jake's stomach dropped. Someone was spying on him. His first instinct was to shoot the damn thing out of the sky, but instead, he grabbed his truck keys and drove straight toward the SUV, parking right behind it so it couldn't leave. Stepping out, he rapped his knuckles against the driver's side window. The man inside, a weaselly-looking guy in a cheap suit, jumped and quickly wrote it down. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake demanded. The man stammered, just checking on a local property dispute. Jake snorted. "Yeah? And I'm the damn Pope. Who sent you? Let me guess your name starts with a K." The guy swallowed hard, avoiding eye contact. "I can't say." Jake leaned in, voice low. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack up your little spy toy and get off my land. If I see you again, I'm calling the sheriff. If I see that drone again, I'm shooting it down. Do we understand each other?" The man nodded frantically. Yeah, got it." Jake took a step back, watching as the SUV peeled out of there like it was on fire. By the time he got back to the house, there was already a new HOA letter in his mailbox, a new list of violations. This time, Jake had enough. That night he called his lawyer. The next morning he had a formal cease and desist order drafted and sent directly to the HOA. Then, just for good measure, he made copies and handed one directly to the sheriff's office. Karen wanted to play dirty, fine, but two could play this game. And unlike Karen, Jake knew how to win. Jake had always been a patient man, but everyone had their limits, and Karen had crossed the line. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one, but unlike Karen, he wasn't going to play dirty. He was going to play smart, and the first move in his counterattack make her regret every single complaint she had ever filed. The first order of business was dealing with the rooster situation. Karen had whined about one rooster, waking up her delicate HOA members. Fine, Jake bought 3 more. Every morning at exactly 5 a.m., a symphony of crowing echoed across Crestwood Estates, bouncing off their perfectly landscaped lawns and into their overpriced cookie-cutter homes. The complaints came rolling in almost immediately, but Jake didn't care. His farm was legally zoned for agricultural purposes, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. But that was just the beginning. Next, Jake tackled the issue of aesthetic impact. If Karen wanted to complain about how his land ruined the HOA's picturesque community, he was going to lean into it. He planted an entire field of sunflowers along the property line, giant, towering sunflowers that grew so tall they blocked the HOA's view of his farm entirely. Now, instead of seeing an ugly barn, the residents of Crestwood got to enjoy a solid wall of bright yellow petals every time they stepped into their backyards. But HOA members weren't sure whether to be annoyed or impressed. But the real masterpiece? That came with his weekly farm event. Jake had a buddy, Mason, who ran the local farmers market, and together they came up with an idea. Why not host a community farm day, open to everyone except, of course, HOA board members? He printed flyers, posted on Facebook, and within days the entire town was buzzing about it. When the weekend rolled around, dozens of families showed up. Kids ran around feeding the goats, petting the cows, and laughing as they chased chickens. Locals bought fresh eggs, homemade jams, and farm-grown vegetables. A few local musicians even volunteered to play live country music, turning the event into an all-out festival. And Karen? She lost her damn mind. She stormed onto Jake's property in the middle of the event, eyes blazing with fury, waving her clipboard like it was some kind of holy decree. "This is completely unacceptable," she screeched, pushing her way through the crowd. "You cannot just turn your farm into a public attraction." Jake, who was casually leaning against a fence post, took a slow sip of his lemonade. "Oh, but I can," he said with a grin. "See, I checked the county laws and my property is fully zoned for agritourism." Karen's eye twitched. But the noise, the parking, all legal, county approved," Jake interrupted, gesturing to the cheerful crowd around them. "And the people love it," he smirked. "In fact, I think I might make it a weekly thing, maybe even expand it into a full farmer's market." Karen opened and closed her mouth, looking like she might actually explode, but with nothing left to argue, she did what Karen did best. She stormed off, furious, defeated. But Jake knew she wasn't done. And he was right. A few days later, he started noticing strange cars parked near his property at odd hours. At first he thought it was just nosy HOA members, but then he saw it a drone. It wasn't subtle. Either it hovered over his land, moving deliberately, as if recording footage. Jake had enough. That evening, he parked his truck near the road and waited. Sure enough, a black sedan pulled up, and a familiar weaselly-looking man stepped out, the same guy from last time, the private investigator. Jake got out of his truck and walked over, casual but firm. "Let me guess," Jake drawled. "Just checking on a local property dispute?" The guy froze, clearly not expecting to be caught. Look, man, I'm just—" "Save it," Jake cut in, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Here's what's going to happen. You're leaving, right now. And if I see you or that damn drone anywhere near my farm again, I'm pressing charges. You got that?" The investigator nodded furiously, backed away, and practically sprinted to his car. But Jake wasn't done. That night, he made a direct move against the HOA. He showed up uninvited to their board meeting, walking in like he owned the place. The second he stepped through the doors, every head turned. Karen, standing at the front, went pale. "You're not supposed to be here," she hissed. Jake ignored her. He strolled up to the table, slapped down a thick stack of legal documents, and crossed his arms. "This," he said, "is a formal cease and desist order. You've been harassing me, pressing on my land, filing false complaints, and now you're sending people to spy on me. It ends now. If it doesn't, I'll be suing, not just the HOA, but you personally. Karen." The room went dead silent. A few HOA members shifted uncomfortably, clearly not as enthusiastic about Karen's crusade as she was. Then an older man, Richard, the actual HOA president, flipped through the documents and let out a heavy sigh. "Karen," he said finally, rubbing his temples, "what the hell have you done?" Karen's face turned red. "I was just trying to—" "This HOA has no jurisdiction over his land," Richard cut her off, "and if he has security footage of that investigator, we're looking at serious legal trouble." Karen looked around, realizing she was losing control. You can't be serious. He's ruining the neighborhood." Richard shook his head. "Karen, you've done good work here, but I think you've taken this too far." The other board members nodded in agreement. That was the moment Karen realized she wasn't just losing the battle, she was losing the war. The board scheduled an emergency vote. Jake didn't even need to stay to hear the outcome. He already knew. Karen was done, and Jake, he had just won. The downfall of Karen Whitmore wasn't sudden, it was glorious, a slow-motion train wreck that everyone in town had a front-row seat for. The night of the emergency HOA meeting, the very people who had once cowered under Karen's rule finally turned on her. Jake didn't even need to stay, the writing was already on the wall. The board voted, and just like that, Karen was officially removed as HOA enforcer. It was over. She tried to fight it, of course argued, pleaded, even threatened legal action, but the reality was, without the board backing her, she had no power. Richard, the HOA president, sealed her fate with a single sentence. "Karen, you are no longer authorized to represent this HOA in any capacity. And honestly, after everything you've done, you should consider selling your house, because no one in this neighborhood wants you here anymore." It was checkmate. The very next morning, a moving truck appeared in front of Karen's house. At first people thought she was just bluffing, that she'd dig in and refuse to leave, but the rumors were true. Karen wasn't just leaving the HOA, she was leaving town. The news spread like wildfire, and by midday half the neighborhood had gathered outside just to watch. Some pretended to be out for a stroll, others conveniently walked their dogs past her driveway, but everyone had the same goal, to witness the fall of the Queen. Jake, meanwhile, enjoyed the show from his porch, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, listening as Karen furiously barked orders at the movers, her face red with frustration. But Jake wasn't done delivering justice. That same afternoon, he had a brand-new sign made and planted it right at the edge of his property, facing Crestwood Estates. The bold black letters read, "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, no O, no Karens, no problems." It became a town landmark. People from all over stopped by to take pictures, and soon enough, Karen's name was nothing more than a bad memory. But karma wasn't finished with her just yet. A few months later, word got around that Karen had moved into another HOA-run neighborhood in a different town, thinking she could climb her way back into power. But what she hadn't realized was that this new HOA already had an enforcer, someone just as ruthless and power-hungry as she had been. Within weeks, Karen found herself on the receiving end of the same ridiculous HOA fines she had once inflicted on others. Her grass was half an inch too high, her car was parked too close to the curb, and when she tried to assert herself, the new HOA president shut her down so fast it made her head spin. By the time Jake heard about it, Karen had already put her new house up for sale. Poetic justice at its finest. Meanwhile, Jake's farm thrived. His weekend market expanded, turning into one of the town's biggest attractions. Even some former HOA members became regular visitors, happily buying eggs and vegetables from the very farm Karen had once tried to destroy. Jake never saw Karen again, but every now and then, when he sat on his porch, coffee in hand, he'd glance at the sign by his property zone, and the one that proudly reminded everyone that Mitchell Farms was a Karen-free zone, and he'd smile. Because in the end, karma had done exactly what it was supposed to.